Friends, just a 5-minute warning, and also to say we've just found a credit card, Mr. Ricky D. Weeks. So if you've lost a credit card and your name's Mr. Ricky D. Weeks, do please come to the north door facing John Lewis. Thank you. We'll just be 5 minutes. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to All Saints for this anniversary Athelstan address. Like many of you, I have in recent times found myself slightly addicted to a certain podcast called The Rest is History. And when listening to that, it cheered my heart to hear how Athelstan was being revived and worked his way through the World Cup of English monarchs to succeed as King of Kings. Our guest speaker today, Tom Holland, has been responsible, I think, for a wonderful renaissance of interest in history in general, and in particular for these 10th century kings, the family they came from, and it is my great delight to invite him to speak today on the title of The Golden Generations, the Founding Family of England.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Joe, for that introduction. I admire your courage in hailing Athelstan as the King of Kings in a church in front of a bishop. Very impressive. And I would like to thank you and everybody who's been involved in this tremendous day. Historical anniversaries come and go, but they're not always fun. And there's no question that today has been tremendous fun. The launching of the King Athelstan train. King Athelstan train, not a phrase I thought that I would ever utter, but how wonderful it is that such a thing now exists. And then this joyous occasion here, the kind of wonderful murals, the sense of community. It's very moving, and it's something that all of Kingston clearly has been sharing over the course of the entire summer. It's wonderful. But I think that what we're celebrating today, or what we're marking, the Welsh and Scots may have other views on whether we're celebrating it, is it has relevance far beyond the civic borders of Kingston, because what happened here in Kingston 1100 years ago today is a crucial waymarker on the creation of the nation-state of England. And the story is one that I have always been interested in since I was a child. In fact, I've always kind of slightly felt that it was personal to me. So just indulge me, if you will, if I give a bit of personal history. Because the Hollands, my paternal line, come from the Midlands. They were apparently, they lived in Derby and stitched woolen stockings back in the 18th century, and then one of them rose to become a shopkeeper, and I'm afraid to say disgraced himself by employing dodgy weights, got run out of town, went to Staffordshire, became a coal miner. The Hollands then migrated to Birmingham, which is where my father grew up. It's why I continue to support Aston Villa, even though they're currently 19th in the Premier League. So I do have a certain kind of residual loyalty to the Midlands. But I grew up in Wiltshire, outside a small market town called Wilton. And as a child, I couldn't help noticing whenever we drove into Wilton that there was a very proud sign on the town notice board saying that it was the ancient capital of Wessex. And I thought this was great, brilliant. I'm growing up outside the ancient capital of Wessex. What was Wessex, and was Wilton really the ancient capital? And so I investigated and explored and started reading books on it. It was the first real period of English history that I became engaged with. I was very disappointed to find out that Wilton hadn't really been the ancient capital of Wessex, but it had been the capital of Wiltshire, Wiltonshire. You know, the clue is in the name. And Wiltshire in turn had been the heartland of Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, and since I was very proud of Wiltshire, I decided that, brilliant, Wessex, the West Saxons, I'm all over the West Saxons. And it turned out that Wessex had, in a sense, been the motor of very great events, kind of 1,000 years and more before my lifetime. And it had been ruled by some very famous kings. And these kings had enshrined Wilton, the county town of Wiltshire, as one of the kind of the great, dare I say, sacral centres of the West Saxon kingdom. Alfred the Great, who I knew all about because he appeared in a Ladybird book, fantastic cover of him addressing a Viking with great feathers on his helmet, which I was disappointed in due course to find out Vikings hadn't worn. Alfred the Great, I was thrilled to find, he'd loved Wilton. He'd founded a convent there. And his son, Edward, had sent 2 of his daughters there as nuns. And Edward's son, Athelstan, so we're now into the 3rd generation, he had made it, he'd made 2 grants of land to the convent, the Abbey of Wilton. But I realised reading about Alfred the Great, Edward, Athelstan, these three generations, that it wasn't, sadly, just about Wiltshire. I realised that the story that I'd come across because of the role of these kings in the story of Wilton, this was a story that also reverberated across the whole of England. Because if Wiltshire back in the 9th century had been part of a kingdom called Wessex, then the Midlands, Birmingham, where my dad had come from, they had constituted another kingdom called Mercia. And Wessex, obviously the kingdom of the West Saxons, but the Mercians had not called themselves Saxons. They had called themselves Angles. And they weren't the only people to do that. There was another kingdom, East Anglia. They too called themselves Angles. Again, the clue is in the name. And north of the Humber, in Northumbria, there were more Angles yet. And so this was how I discovered the fact that England hadn't always been England. That there had been all kinds, initially there'd been lots of other Saxon kingdoms as well. The East Saxons, Essex, the South Saxons, Sussex. Wessex had absorbed these, and there was the sense that the process of how all these various scattered kingdoms had absorbed one another, had accrued, had started to consolidate and perhaps become England, that here was an astonishing story that deserved to be explored more fully. And Alfred the Great and his son and his grandson had played a key role in this story. So Alfred had become king back in a time when Mercia and Northumbria and East Anglia, these were all absolutely disparate kingdoms. They were not joined even in alliance. They were often kind of murderous rivals. Alfred's son, Edward, he had gone on the offensive. He had led armies far beyond the boundaries of Wessex. He had marched into East Anglia, and by the end of his life, the borders of the kingdom that he ruled reached all the way up to the Humber and the Mersey. And his son, Athelstan, when Athelstan was crowned here in Kingston 1100 years ago today, he set the seal on the union of the two great kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia, which for centuries and centuries had been very, very bitter rivals. Now Edward, Athelstan's father, King of Wessex, had died on the 17th of July, 924, at a ford just south of Chester, so way deep into Mercia, almost the northern borders of Mercia. And you may wonder, well, what would a West Saxon king be doing deep in the bowels of Mercia? Going by the earlier centuries of Mercian history, the reason that a West Saxon king would be present deep in Mercia with an army would be because he was at war with the Mercians. And so you might think that he had died deep in Mercia as a warlord. That was why he was there. Maybe he'd been looting, spreading carnage, burning, all the stuff that West Saxon kings, when they invaded Mercia, had been in the habit of doing for centuries. And Athelstan, his elder son, who succeeded Edward as king, would he not also be viewed by the Mercians as an alien, as a foreigner, as an intruder? You might think that Athelstan and his predecessors would have been viewed by the Angles of Mercia as conquerors. But Athelstan, when he came here on the 4th of September, 925, to be consecrated as king, did not come solely as a West Saxon. And the very choice of Kingston, the royal estate, the king's tun, proclaimed this to everyone. Because what's striking about the fact that Athelstan's consecration happens here in Kingston is that it is not happening in Winchester or even Wilton, the great sacral centres of Wessex. Nor is it happening in Tamworth or Repton, the great sacral centres of Mercia. Instead, it is happening here on the banks of the Thames, which traditionally had constituted the borderline between Wessex and Mercia. And if Athelstan is being crowned as the king of the West Saxons, he is also being crowned as the king of the Mercians. It is not only the ealdormen and the bishops and the abbots of Wessex who are here for the ceremony, it is the ealdormen and the bishops and abbots of the Mercians as well. And the ceremony that is staged here was very deliberately, very consciously freighted in symbolism. It was a consecration unlike any that had been held in England before. The Archbishop of Canterbury, a guy called Athelstan, had prepared for it with great care and attention. And when he stands up, he tells the congregation in front of him, all the assembled lords of both Mercia and Wessex, that Athelstan has been elected king of both kingdoms pariter, Latin for equally. Athelstan is equally king of both kingdoms, and he is acclaimed as such by the crowds witnessing the ceremony. And Athelstan is doubly consecrated as king. So he is anointed with oil, as kings in the Old Testament had been. Athelstan is being enshrined as a leader who stands in a line of succession from Saul and David and Solomon in the Bible. But he is also, for the first time, crowned. He is not adorned, as was traditional in England, with a helmet. Those of us who witnessed the coronation of Charles III may regret this. It would have been tremendous to have watched the king be crowned with a helmet. Instead, we get a crown, a kind of band of gold with rays that evoke the sense of the rays of the sun. And if the holy oil associates Athelstan with the biblical kings, these crowns associate him with the traditions of Rome. Athelstan is a sacral king, and he is an heir of the Roman emperors. And this ceremony is momentous, not just because of the symbolism, but because it's a kind of pivot between two ages. It looks backwards and it looks forwards. So looking backwards first, what had brought Athelstan to this moment where he stands here on the banks of the Thames to be crowned king of two kingdoms? And what was it that had brought these age-old rivals, the West Saxons and the Angles of Mercia, to be joined in hailing Athelstan as king? So I've said they were kind of old enemies. They were traditional rivals. But then in the 9th century, everything had changed, and it changed for a reason that I'm sure you will all know. People whose name I have deliberately refrained from mentioning until this point, and that is, of course, the Vikings. And the Vikings have been turning up, and I'm afraid to say generally behaving very badly, since the 790s. Most notoriously, they had sacked the shrine of St. Cuthbert on Holy Island, Lindisfarne, but they had launched a series of raids. They were not Christian. There were loads of glorious Christian churches and shrines full of loot, and the Vikings just kept coming and nicking it. And by 865, they decided to go one stage better. Rather than just nick stuff, they thought that they would come over and settle and colonize. and they set to dismembering the various independent kingdoms of England with great relish. They dismembered Northumbria, they killed the king of East Anglia, and they then started to turn their eyes on the two surviving kingdoms, Mercia and Wessex. And the West Saxons and the Mercians, faced with this mortal, existential threat, began to huddle together. And it is striking that Alfred, the youngest of a large number of brothers, all of whom die in large part, I think, because of the strain of trying to stave the Vikings off, he, in 868, had married a Mercian lady, Aelswith, which provided the kind of marital symbol of the kind of the desperate alliance that these two ancient kingdoms had forged. But it didn't really help the Mercians. So in 874, the last independent king of Mercia had fled abroad. The Vikings descended on the great Catacomb, the great necropolis in Repton, where the Mercian kings were buried, and desecrated it. And they appointed a puppet king. This puppet king, we don't really know what happened to him. He clearly didn't last very long. Mercia was swallowed up as Northumbria and East Anglia had been swallowed up. And Wessex, to coin a phrase, now stood alone as the last kingdom. Alfred is remembered as the Great because he fought and suffered and triumphed greatly. Alone among the kings of Anglo-Saxon England, he succeeded in staving off conquest by the Vikings. I mean, it has to be said, he did it by the skin of his teeth, ambushed in Chippenham on Twelfth Night, fled into the Isles of Athelney, famously distracted by pondering how to save his kingdom and destroying his chance of winning the Great British Bake Off. He nevertheless emerges from the ignominious exile in the swamps to defeat the Vikings and to force them to negotiate. And the Viking king Guthrum is obliged to accept baptism. He takes the baptismal name of Athelstan. David Woodman has written a brilliant new biography of Athelstan, which is available for sale, I think, advances the theory that perhaps the naming of this Viking king influenced the naming of Athelstan, who in due course would be crowned here. So read that, it's absolutely fascinating. Now, by the terms of this treaty that Alfred signs with the Vikings that he's defeated, the frontiers of Wessex are to be respected by the Vikings, and Mercia, which no longer has a king at its head, it's agreed. It's a kind of it's agreed that it will be divided in two, on a kind of a line following from the Mersey all the way down to the Thames. One half will essentially come under the influence of Wessex, and the other half will be a kind of Vichy, subordinate Viking realm. Very much kind of the Vikings are allowed to colonise and settle there. And of course the Vikings have conquered East Anglia, so they also have that, and there are Viking kingdoms in York and in the north. So Alfred may have secured Wessex, but there are still a hell of a lot of Vikings out there, and it's quite alarming and nerve-wracking. And so it's perhaps not surprising that Alfred should have dreamed of forging perhaps a new identity for the people of England that not just Saxons but Angles could share in. And so he starts to promote himself as the Rex Anglo-Saxonum, the king of the Angles and the Saxons. And he would say that he is doing this for the good of all the Christian people of England, that if the Angles and the Saxons do not join together, then they will assuredly be wiped out because they're separate. How exactly the Angles feel about this, we can't be 100% certain. But I think if you look at the way in which the Mercians respond to Alfred's leadership, you can see that it's not, they would rather have a West Saxon as king than have a pagan Viking. Alfred is calling himself king of the Angles as well as the Saxons, so is he king of Mercia? Well, kind of and kind of not. He has as his lieutenant in Mercia a guy called Aethelred. Aethelred does not take the title of a king, but he is given the title of Mirchnachlafod, which is translated as Lord of the Mercians. And I have to say, I do regret the fact that when the mayoralty of the West Midlands was instituted, that the mayor of the West Midlands is not known as Lord or the Lady of the Mercians. A real wasted opportunity. So if Ed Davies here, perhaps he could sort that out. And Aethelred, the Lord of the Mercians, he gets very bad press from Bernard Cornwall, I'm afraid to say. He's a bit of a toad. But as far as we can tell, he seems to have been very loyal, very effective. He's a very loyal ally to Alfred. In 893, there's a great battle at Farnham. Aethelred comes with all kinds of Mercian contingents, does very good service, sees the Vikings off again. And as a symbol of this kind of emerging sense of commonality between the West Saxons and the Mercians, Aethelred has, as his wife, as Mircna Hlafdiga, she will become the Lady of the Mercians, Alfred's daughter, Aethelflad. And Aethelflad is a remarkable woman, and it's wonderful to see her alongside all those men at the far end of the church on those kind of wonderful illustrations. So she's the daughter of Alfred, and she's very much a chip off the old block. She's very devout, she's very learned, and she is no less martial in her ambitions for the Mercians, her adopted people, than Alfred had been for the West Saxons. She is an extraordinary leader, and Aethelred seems to have fallen sick and kind of lingered, and then he dies in 911, and Aethelfled essentially takes over the reins of power. She rules alone as Lady of the Mercians. And I would say that she obviously doesn't compare in fame with Elizabeth I, but I would say that she ranks alongside Elizabeth as perhaps the most remarkable and influential woman in English political history. And again, from my childhood, I kind of admired her. I felt a certain sense of devotion to her. And she was responsible for a coin. I think there are only kind of 14 of the surviving of these coins left, and I have a copy. I have one of these coins, and it's one of my two most precious possessions, alongside the skeleton of a dinosaur that I bought in an auction in Salisbury, a Psittacosaurus. This coin actually was even more expensive. I'm not going to be vulgar and say how much it was, but it was an eye-watering amount, which is the measure of how precious it is to me. And I think its preciousness as a historical artifact, because although it has the name of Edward on it, Edward by now has become king. He's the king of Wessex. Aethelflad is kind of subordinate to him, so the coin is minted under the aegis of Edward as king of Wessex. Nevertheless, we know that it's Aethelflad who is responsible for it, because it is minted in Chester. And Chester is one of a line of great fortresses that Edward and Aethelflad, between them, have been building, inspired by the example of Alfred, who, after the defeat of the Vikings, had started planting what were called burhs, great walled strongholds that, kind of a bit like the pyramids, employed vast numbers of people to build. And they served as great military centres. And in due course, under Athelflaed and Edward, a great line of burhs is built again, stretching all the way from the Mersey down to the Thames, kind of the frontier, to try and see the Vikings off. And this coin that I have, it was minted in Chester, and it's not surprising that it has on it a tower. And I think clearly one of the things that this tower is symbolising is the kind of the great martial effort required to build these burhs. And Chester in particular was on the front line against the Vikings. There were Vikings in York, there were Vikings in Dublin, and the Mersey was obviously a kind of key line of communication between these two great Viking strongholds. And so by building up Chester, which had been a kind of abandoned Roman city, clearing it of nettles, fortifying the walls anew, Athelflaed was able to interrupt that chain of communications between the two great Viking centres. And in fact, very heroically, that there had been a Viking siege. They tried to capture Chester, and Athelflaed and the defenders of Chester had seen the Vikings off in two brilliant ways. The first was they had boiled great vats of beer, which they then poured over the Vikings, and the Vikings didn't like that at all because it was scalding. And the other thing, they would drop beehives on the Vikings. So you either got boiled to death by beer or stung to death by bees. So Athelflaed, tremendous. Very innovative military figure. But if this great tower on her coin clearly represents her martial endeavours, it also represents her status as a woman of learning, a fosterer of the arts of peace, and a devout Christian, because it is also, I think, clearly symbolising the tower of a church. And Athelflaed, like her father, as well as being very proficient in fighting Vikings, was also incredibly devout. And she recognised in, say, the relics of the saints, a very potent military weapon. So she commissioned this extraordinary raid deep into Viking Mercia to redeem the relics of St. Oswald, the Northumbrian king who had been dismembered and commemorated as a martyr, and whose relics lay deep in Viking-held Lincolnshire. And Athelflaed grabbed these relics, brought them back to Gloucester, and enshrined them there. And the power of these relics, it was kind of like Star Wars or something, not as in Darth Vader, but as in the Reagan defense shield over America. The radiance of this saint's power was such that it could, in Athelflaed's opinion, defend Mercia from invasion. And so it proved, because the Vikings of Lincolnshire, absolutely furious that they'd lost their relics, launched a massive invasion of Athelflaed's realm, looting and burning as they went. And then they were returning back to Viking Mercia when they were ambushed outside Wolverhampton at a place called Woden'sfield in 910, and they were completely annihilated. So again, hooray for Athelflaed. So martial power, a devout ability to harness the power of saints, but also she's very, very good at making her people rich, because as also is her brother Edward, because these burhs, these great fortresses, because they provide security, they can also provide marketplaces, and these marketplaces in turn can start generating trade and cash. And so as these markets flourish evermore, and Kingston would be another example of a flourishing marketplace, it gives to Athelflaed and to her brother Edward, the king of the West Saxons, increasing financial and therefore military muscle. And it puts Edward, Athelflaed's overlord, it gives him the status increasingly of a man who can put the whole of Viking-ruled England in his shade. And the whole way through his reign, Edward is looking towards the prospect of redeeming what had been Christian kingdoms, so the kingdom of East Anglia, the truncated half of Viking-ruled Mercia, of redeeming them from the rule of the Vikings. And in 917, he and Aethelflaed, between them, launched an invasion of Viking-held Southumbria. Edward targets East Anglia. Viking rule there is overthrown. It's brought under Edward's direct rule. So when he is conquering East Anglia, he is doing so as a man who can cast himself as the liberator of the Christian Angles who live in that part of Britain. And Aethelflaed, she advances eastwards and she captures Derby, and this signals the imminent implosion of Viking-ruled Mercia. Now, it's very sad that the year after this great triumph, Aethelflaed, I'm afraid to say, dies, and Edward immediately swoops. Aethelflaed and Aethelred had one child. It was a daughter. Obviously, Aethelflaed's achievements demonstrated that being a woman did not preclude you from being an incredibly effective ruler in early 10th century England. But unfortunately, Edward he's the first of a large number of badly behaved royal uncles in English history, which stretches from him right the way up to Prince Andrew. He swoops in and he packs Alfwyn off to a nunnery, and he basically makes himself king of Mercia. And that's what he's doing when he dies just south of Chester. He's essentially firming up his rule of Mercia. He is looking to secure the northern frontier against the Vikings, and also the western frontier against the still independent princes of Wales. So he dies as king of the West Saxons and effectively of the Mercians. And this union of the two kingdoms, when he dies in 924, I mean, it could so easily have disintegrated. And the reason for that is that I've said that Edward is, he's a kind of badly behaved royal uncle. He's also blazing a path for future English monarchs in the extraordinary number of wives he has. So where Edward leads, Henry VIII and so on will follow. Edward has had 3 wives, possibly even more, kind of a range of concubines. And each one of these 3 wives has been disposed for political advantage. And Athelstan, who is his eldest son, had also been the son of the first wife to be elbowed aside, which had made him a bit of embarrassment to Edward. And so Athelstan, the young boy, had been packed off. He had been sent to his aunt, Aethelflaed, up in Mercia, and it seems exceedingly likely that this is where he had grown up. So although he is the grandson of Alfred the Great and the son of the king of the West Saxons, it seems that he had essentially grown up kind of culturally as a Mercian, and therefore when his father dies, he could command the loyalty of the Mercian lords. And it seems that he is, the moment his father dies, he is proclaimed by the Mercians as their king. Now, the issue is, what will happen in Wessex? What do the West Saxons think? And there's a massive problem, because Edward has had another son who has been raised in Winchester as the heir apparent. And this is a guy who rejoices in the tremendous name of Alf Weird. Alf Weird, he does not seem keen on ceding the rule of his father's kingdom to his elder brother. And so he musters an army and he marches northwards. And just beyond Oxford, he dies. Coincidence? We don't know. It's striking that no one really suggests it. It kind of seems obvious. It's very conveniently timed for Athelstan. but nobody really suggests it, so maybe it really was what it seemed, just a kind of died of natural causes, or maybe not. We can't be sure. But certainly there's no question that Athelstan is not popular among the kind of higher echelons in Winchester and the West Saxon heartlands. I think there is a feeling perhaps that he is too Mercian. They would much rather have had Alfweird. And that, I think, is why there is such a long delay between the death of Edward and the coronation of Athelstan here in Kingston, because it's over a year and kind of 1.5 months following the death of Edward. But, as we said, Athelstan is crowned here, and he is crowned Rex Anglo-Saxonum. He enshrines himself from the beginning as the ruler of an authentically Anglo-Saxon realm. And it's possible to imagine a counterfactual in which the contours of Great Britain stay like that. You could imagine, the decades and then the centuries pass, and the realm ruled by Athelstan, basically a kind of Anglo-Saxon realm of Southumbria, that the frontier stays between the Mersey and the Humber. And north of that, there might have been a kind of Anglo-Viking realm centred on York. And beyond that, the nascent kingdom of Alba, the kingdom of the Scots. And it's perfectly possible to imagine a future for Britain, I think, in which Great Britain is divided into kind of 3 if you go upwards and 4 if you include Wales. But that is not what happens. And it happens because of the events in 927, which I think in many ways is at least a significant date in English and British history as 1066. And speaking as the presenter of a patriotic podcast, I would like to think that 927 is a year which marks glorious English victories, that perhaps secondary school students could start their history course with that, rather than with a humiliating defeat. I cannot imagine the Americans or the French beginning with a disastrous defeat. You wouldn't get the French beginning their history course with Agincourt. It's mad. So what happens? Well, in 927, the king of York, a guy with a tremendous sobriquet of Silkbeard, dies. Athelstan seizes his chance. He moves in, takes it over. It seems to have been pretty precarious, his rule, so he mints coins with pictures of the Minster, the great cathedral in York, and this seems to have been an attempt to curry favour with the Archbishop of York, who basically was much keener on having a Viking king than Athelstan. But effectively, the Anglian kingdom of Northumbria is now brought into this kind of nascent Anglo-Saxon kingdom. And in fact, Athelstan is now ruling a kingdom that is more Anglian than it is Saxon. And it's from this point onwards that he starts calling himself Rex Anglorum. And what does he mean by the Anglorum? Well, he kind of, Rex Angli, the king of the Angles. But Angles is starting to mean something more than the kind of the sense of being something different from Saxons. It's the idea that Saxon and Angle identity can be summed up by what in Old English comes to be called the Anglekin, the English. This is where the idea of there being a people called the English is starting to gestate now that Athelstan has conquered the north. And on the 12th of July, 927, a great meeting is held at Amon Bridge in Cumbria, which is very out of the way. But the reason it's held there is it's a frontier zone. And it's not just the Anglian lords of Northumbria who are invited there, but also the kings of Wales, the princes of Wales and the king of Alba. They also come. And just as the Anglian lords acknowledge Athelstan as king of the Anglekin, king of the English, so also do the Scottish and Welsh princes acknowledge Athelstan as Rex Totius Britanniae, king of the whole of Britain. And this is a title that Athelstan takes very, very seriously. And in 934, when the king of the Scots is not behaving as Athelstan thinks he should, Athelstan leads an expedition all the way from Winchester, marches up through Northumbria, stops off at Chesterfield Street to pay his respects to St. Cuthbert, whose miraculously preserved corpse is kept there. And in fact, for many, many decades, has been responsible for the rule of all the lands between the Tyne and the Tees, and has been doing a tremendous job, even though he's dead. And I think for people despairing of our current political leadership, the thought that we might hand the rule of Britain over to the corpse of a saint, I throw it out there. It's an exciting possibility that it has worked before, it may work again. And on Athelstan goes up into the north. He wipes the floor with the King of Alba, the King of the Scots, and it seems like everything is sorted out. But it isn't, because the Scots are resentful, the Welsh hate Athelstan, and the Vikings, I mean, they've been thrown out of York, they're very, very resentful too. And so the Scots, the Vikings and the Welsh, they all gang up and they launch a massive invasion of this kind of precarious English kingdom that Athelstan has forged. You know, everything hangs in the balance now. Athelstan goes with his younger brother Edmund. There's a great battle at a place called Brunanburh, and hooray, Athelstan wins. Famously, we don't know where Brunanburh was. All kinds of different theories. I don't think we will ever know. Apologies if there's anyone here from the Wirral. Is there anyone here from the Wirral? Great. Okay. I don't think it's the Wirral, even though that's they're developing the entire tourist industry. Athelstan, of course, he does not succeed in forging a united kingdom of Great Britain, but he does absolutely lay the foundations for a united kingdom of England. It is true that after his death, various kind of elements of Northumbria kind of seem to crumble away, but they are reconstituted, and the memory of the kingdom that Athelstan had ruled burns bright throughout the 10th century. And by the time of Edgar, whose portrait we have down there, and certainly Ethelred the Unready, the idea of a kingdom of England with one ruler, one church, one language, a sense of the Anglican as a single people, this is starting to emerge. And really the only rival that England has as the most precocious nation state in Europe is Denmark. So it's an amazing achievement. And it's not surprising that Athelstan's memory was cherished by the English throughout the 10th century, throughout the 11th century, and especially after the great catastrophe of 1066. So William of Malmesbury, I know we have visitors here from Malmesbury, so a big shout out for William of Malmesbury. In the 12th century, he wrote in his History of England, "The opinion of the English that Athelstan governed them with a greater concern for law and for education than anyone else in their history is a just one." And we can see this, I think, in Athelstan's law codes, which he was always issuing. You get the sense reading these law codes that he issues one and then he's getting anxious that perhaps he hasn't quite got it right, and he consults with his bishops, and then he he issues revised versions. And the bishops are pushing him in an ever more progressive, woke manner. So, for instance, the death penalty for theft initially is 10 years old, but Athelstan, wokester, then raises it to 13. And then in a shocking display of woke progressivism, he raises it to 15. So you can see there, I think what that expresses is Athelstan's concern to do right by his people and to be able to, in due course, to justify himself at the day of judgment before the throne of God. And in his charters too, you can see hints of the concern that Athelstan felt for his people, even the poorest of them. So there's a charter that he issues in Amesbury, not far from Stonehenge, in Wiltshire, hooray, on Christmas Eve, and it's a grant of land that he gives to one of his thanes. But he specifies that anyone who's hungry or homeless, who comes onto this land, that these people are to be looked after. And Athelstan specifies, "My wish it is that you should always provide the destitute with food." And it's clear that he is, it's Christmas Eve. He must be thinking about the Christmas story of Mary and Joseph arriving in Bethlehem and having nowhere to sleep. But it is expressive, I think, of a sense that Athelstan, although he is a great warrior, is also concerned to do right by his people. And this, I think, is crucial in building a kind of nascent, precarious sense of loyalty to the idea of a kingdom called Engleland, the land of the Anglican, of the Angli, which emerges over the course of the 10th century into the 11th century, even though there are repeated fractures. So even in the aftermath of Ethelred's disastrous reign, Wessex and Mercia are kind of divided up again. It's the last time it happens, but that sense of the fracture line is still there, but it's healing as the decades go by. So I think it is absolutely fair to see Alfred and Edward and Athelstan as the founding fathers of England, and of course Athelflaed as the founding mother of England. And the lesson that their reigns and the efforts of the kings that followed them is that it's hard work to fashion a united kingdom out of the disparate elements that are being forged and joined together. And I suspect that Athelstan, who dies quite young, that he dies, maybe I'm kind of projecting here, but perhaps he dies from sheer exhaustion, because there is a sense, I think, among those who knew him, that the labours that he undertook were prodigious. So 2.5 decades after his death, there was a bishop called Athelwold, who looked, living in the age of Edgar, this king called the Peaceable, not because he was a hippie, but because he maintained peace at the point of the sword, which was basically what people wanted from a king. And in the reign of Edgar, Athelwold, this bishop, looks at what England has become, and he pays kind of moving tribute to the kings who had made it happen. And he wrote of these kings, "Mature in age and very prudent and far-seeing in wisdom, and hard to overcome in any strife." That's his epitaph for them. Very moving expression of gratitude, I think, in the context of a land that had been devastated by Vikings for so long. And Athelwold, he had been close enough in time to Athelstan's reign to have been a protege of the great king. And perhaps because of that, he understood the debt that he and everyone in this nascent kingdom of England had towards Athelstan and his forebears. And I think it is tremendous that an event like this, in a sense, is doing the same. It's kind of acknowledging the debt that we all have towards those kings and that lady who lived 1100 years and more ago. And that's why I'm so glad and proud and honoured to have been asked to speak at this event, and why I am very grateful on behalf of Athelstan for everyone who has contributed to putting it on. Thank you very much.
Tom, a huge thank you for such a vivid and passionate account of those kings and their family, and what we can rightly be proud of, and what I think deserves to be much better known. So thank you for presenting it in such a wonderful way. I think we've got time for just a couple of questions. So if somebody has a question they're itching to ask, Michael, my colleague, is going to come round with a microphone.
But please don't make it too hard.
Do we have a... Okay, Sarah, who's our resident storyteller. So this better be good, Sarah.
Yeah, there it is, I promise you. Great. Okay, so is it on? Is it on? I'll just shout. Athelstan didn't have any children, and obviously here at All Saints we're particularly interested in how the crown was passed on to various kings as well. So the succession is something that we're very interested in. He didn't have any children, so could you tell us a little bit about any theory that you have around that? Because there's obviously a couple, maybe he chose not to placate the Saxons, the West Saxons, or potentially he may have even been gay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So there is lots of speculation around that, as there is, say, with Edward the Professor, who likewise doesn't have children. And absolutely, the notion that Athelstan might have been gay is quite popular. There's no evidence for it whatsoever, and I think it's to back project a 21st century sense of sexual identities onto the distant past that I think is probably not justified, because I think there are likelier explanations, one of which we're told is that Athelstan does not have children because he does not want to cause problems for his brothers and their children. You know, he probably had a sense that the Mercia and Wessex had been spared civil war between him and Alfred by the skin of their teeth. There had been a kind of a similar brush with cousins fighting each other in his father's reign. And he knew the stakes. He knew that any dissension in the House of Wessex would open up opportunities for the Vikings and for the Welsh and for the Scots that he didn't want to give them. So I think he if you like, he kind of consecrates himself to his kingdom. But I think it's much likelier that he consecrates himself to God, that he consecrates his virginity to God, because, as you know, we are told he's a very, very devout man, and that seems to me a likelier explanation than the fact that, you know, secretly he's dying to go off to heaven, or whatever, heaven or nightclub, rather than. I think the heaven that he wants is the heaven that's up there.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more here, David.
Thank you for your lecture. Clearly Athelstan's reputation went quite afar, beyond the islands of Britain. I just wonder how likely you think it is that the Byzantine Empire would have known of Athelstan's exploits, and whether actually there's any evidence that ambassadors from Constantinople would have made their way, not just to Athelstan's court, but his grandfather's as well.
Oh, that's exactly the kind of question I was hoping not to get. It's been years and years. However, there is someone who's just published a book which is absolutely brilliant on Athelstan's foreign policy. So...
Can we have the microphone to... This is Professor David Woodman from University of Cambridge, who literally has just published a book which is available in the crossing there. I think David's available to sign copies. David, would you just like to say a few words about that?
I wasn't prepared to be on the spot like this. It's also a very difficult question. What I would say is there are lots of evidence for cross-cultural connections with the East, one of which from Athelstan's court is very, very interesting, an early connection with chess, the game of chess, a game from India. We get this image in a manuscript, a 12th century manuscript in Oxford depicting chess, saying that it's come from the court of Athelstan. So that's one bit of evidence for connections with the East, further East. Whether we have specific details about people, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I mean, and also just to say that the West Saxon kings are very aware of Rome. So Alfred, as a boy, is said to have gone and to have been given the rank of consul by the Pope. The Anglo-Saxons had been redeemed from paganism by Pope Gregory the Great in Rome, and it was believed by the English that at the end of days it was Pope Gregory who would plead for them before the throne of God. So certainly they're aware of Rome, and if they're aware of Rome, then they're certainly very aware of Constantinople as well, and conscious of themselves as part of the kind of commonwealth of Christian powers, of whom the emperor in Constantinople is the greatest. Do you have one more question?
Tom, today we're celebrating Athelstan. And obviously there's 7 kings are supposed to have been crowned here, but 5 are kind of questionable. Have you got any research or any comments on the other 5?
Of course they were all crowned here. Of course they were all crowned here, and of course the coronation stone is completely authentic.
Just to repeat, we're hugely grateful to Tom for such a wonderful address. Let me just say a few final practical comments. So the church is being kept open until 4:30. That should give you an opportunity to have a closer look at the embroideries, or to look at the exhibition of how they've been created and some of the samples that were created by our artistic team in the side chapel, or some of the original designs which are just behind me on the north wall. Also to see David's book, and I think he's available for signing. If you're thirsty, then our Park Brewery is still selling their wonderful Athelstan ale out on the lawn towards the market. The creation of these embroideries is the culmination of the most, I think, wonderful reordering of this church, most of which took place about 10 years ago under the auspices of my predecessor, Jonathan Wilkes. I'm delighted that Jonathan is here today. I can't quite see him at the moment, but he's around. It's literally transformed this building into a 7 days a week community hub, and yet still this wonderful, beautiful space where we can meet to worship, and also for incredible events like this. So these embroideries, filling the 7 niches that were created when the altar was moved away from that high end of the church, is the culmination of that internal restoration of this church. But of course, a building like this doesn't stop throwing up a few things, and now we need to turn our attention to the external bits of the building. There's quite a lot of the buttresses and the masonry that is eroding in a slightly worrying way. There is quite a lot of the tower that is getting a little bit precarious, and at some stage the roof is going to need replacing. So I do ask you, if you would like to show your appreciation for our event today, to make a donation to our Heritage Building Repair Fund, and you can do that either by there's a card reader on each door, or we'll happily take cash off you, or there's a QR code on the back of your programme. So thank you in advance for your generosity with that. Sorry, you're about to tell me something I've forgotten. Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, yeah. He's saying we need the church to close at 4, but well, I'm sure we'll be generous. What we do need to do is close the church a little bit while we set up and for our wonderful festival service that is going to follow at 6:30 when Professor Sarah Foote will be preaching. That will be ready for 5:30. So we'll reopen the doors at 5:30, and I do hope that most of you will come and join us for that fitting end to the day. So thank you very much, and do enjoy the rest of the day.